After careful consideration and reviewing the current eligibility guidelines, I am officially declaring myself a WNBA prospect. If simply declaring who you are is all that's required, then I meet every single requirement necessary to compete in the WNBA. My team and I have carefully examined the WNBA's eligibility criteria and governing framework surrounding self-identification and inclusion. Based on the current guidelines, I can and I am officially declaring my eligibility for the upcoming WNBA Draft in May 2027.
An NBA star has declared himself eligible for the WNBA. And this isn't being presented as a joke. The player says he's read the league's eligibility rules, studied the language surrounding who can compete, and believes the rules themselves create a question the WNBA can't simply ignore. But there's another reason this would become explosive. Because his target isn't just the league. It's Brittney Griner. And suddenly, Sophie Cunningham becomes part of the story too. Cunningham has already made her position clear on protecting women's sports, and that position has put her directly against some of the strongest voices inside the WNBA. Now imagine an NBA player taking that same controversy and turning it into a direct challenge. Not by arguing with Cunningham. Not by attacking the league's coaches. But by forcing the WNBA to answer one simple question. If your rules are supposed to apply equally, what happens when someone you never expected actually uses those rules against you?
My enemies close,
that is where this
then I
story
keep my
gets
friends.
interesting. Because once you connect the eligibility debate, Cunningham's public comments, the league's response, and the growing controversy surrounding Griner and Caitlin Clark, this stops looking like one isolated basketball story. It becomes a much bigger fight over who controls the rules, and who gets to decide what those rules actually mean. And the strangest part? The player making the challenge may not even need to win a single basketball game to create the biggest problem the WNBA has faced. The most important part of this story isn't the physical advantage an NBA player might bring into the WNBA.
I think it's trans rights now is our new battle. That's what I think I was saying, that like the battles have changed. You know, like our intentions have been the same, but now the environment has changed. We see trans people's rights being, stripped away from them. There's a lot of discourse around trans athletes and what they can compete in. I would welcome a trans athlete on my team or against my team anytime. I don't think it's a problem in the world. It's just another way to kind of attack trans people. We've seen players like Lasia Clarendon who stepped into that forefront and have been brave enough and courageous enough to kind of step up. So I guess that's the next battle that we have to fight as athletes.
It's the question that comes before the basketball. Would the league even allow it? According to the competitor material, former NBA player Enes Kanter Freedom publicly declared himself a WNBA prospect and argued that he had reviewed the league's eligibility framework. That immediately changes the conversation. On August 7, 2026, Enes Kanter Freedom posted a video officially declaring himself eligible for the 2027 WNBA Draft. He argued that the league's own eligibility rules, particularly the lack of a clear definition of woman in the 2026 collective bargaining agreement, left the door open. This was not a hypothetical. It was a direct challenge using the league's own language. Because instead of debating whether an NBA player could compete physically, the debate becomes whether the league's written rules clearly explain who is eligible in the first place. The competitor script points specifically to the WNBA's 2026 collective bargaining agreement and its language concerning women being eligible to play. The argument presented is that the agreement uses the term women without providing the definition people would expect to find in such an important eligibility rule. And that's where the controversy gets its first major opening. Because if a rule is supposed to determine who can enter a professional sports league, the definition behind that rule matters a lot. The WNBA and WNBPA have publicly emphasized inclusion, equity, diversity, and protection for transgender people. But those public positions create another question. What happens when somebody takes that language literally and asks the league to apply it to a situation nobody expected? That's the strategy behind the challenge. And suddenly, the NBA star doesn't have to prove that he belongs in the WNBA. He only has to force the league to explain exactly why he doesn't.
You can't be
a male, born a male, transitioning to female, and think that you should have the right to compete with women. Not in basketball, not in football, not in boxing, not in the UFC. Hell, not even in tennis.
That is a very different battle. And while the league is being pushed to answer that question, another player is already standing at the center of the controversy. Sophie Cunningham. Cunningham could have avoided the entire conversation. She could have given the safest possible answer. Instead, she spoke directly about protecting young girls and women in sports. In the interview referenced by the competitor material, Cunningham said she believed women's sports needed protection and maintained that position even after receiving criticism. She also made an important distinction. She said she did not hate transgender people. She said there was room for everyone. But she also argued that there were specific rights connected to biological women that needed to be protected. That distinction became the heart of the backlash. Because the controversy wasn't simply about what Cunningham believed. It was about what happened after she said it publicly. The competitor script describes coaches and players inside the league responding with a very different position. Minnesota Lynx coach Cheryl Reeve publicly emphasized inclusion. Natalie Nake similarly described sports as a place of belonging and authenticity. Gabby Williams said she would welcome a transgender athlete on her team or against her team. So Cunningham found herself in an unusual position. Her own comments were being challenged by people inside the basketball world she competed in. But outside the league, prominent sports personalities were defending the broader argument she was making.
We have our second former NBA player, Royce White O'Neal, declaring for the WNBA Draft, saying he's identifying as a transgender and that he needs to be allowed to play in the WNBA. We had Enes Kanter do it. I didn't get a chance to cover that because I've been on the plane all day.
And that creates the first major reversal. The player who seemed to be standing alone inside her own league suddenly had powerful voices outside it defending her. But there was still one piece missing. Why would an NBA star suddenly involve himself? And that's where Brittney Griner enters the story. If the NBA star wanted attention, challenging the WNBA's policy would be enough. But targeting Brittney Griner makes the story personal. Griner has spent years building a reputation as one of the most physically imposing players in women's basketball. Her size, length, defensive ability, and experience make her one of the obvious players to mention whenever the conversation turns toward physical mismatches. So putting Griner at the center of this hypothetical confrontation creates an immediate visual. One side brings NBA-level physicality. The other brings WNBA experience, established reputation, and years of understanding how to play against professional women's basketball defenses. But here's where the story becomes more complicated. The debate around Griner isn't happening in isolation. Caitlin Clark has already become one of the biggest names in the league, and the competitor material spends significant time connecting Griner to several controversial physical incidents involving Clark. The script references incidents beginning in 2024 and continuing into 2025 and 2026, including physical contact, screens, and disputed officiating. The important point for the documentary isn't to claim that every controversial play proves a conspiracy. It doesn't. The important point is that these moments became part of the public conversation. Fans saw clips. Commentators debated them. Officials came under scrutiny. And every new incident gave the argument another reason to continue. That matters because the NBA star wouldn't be entering a completely neutral environment.
Inclusion, those are the values that unite this union and allow it to protect women's sports while creating transformational change. Hate, abuse, and demonization of any person or group of people, including transgender people, only fuel fear, division, and harm. We will continue to have hard conversations, but
He would be walking into a league already dealing with a major conversation about physicality, officiating, star treatment, and the treatment of its most visible players. And if he specifically positioned himself as someone who wanted to protect Cunningham and Clark, the controversy would instantly become much bigger. But the real twist is still coming. Because the NBA star's argument doesn't necessarily depend on beating Griner. It depends on forcing the league to defend its own position. This is where the entire story changes direction. At first, it looks like a basketball challenge. An NBA player wants to enter the WNBA. He wants to challenge Griner. He wants to protect Cunningham and Clark. But then the argument moves away from the court. It moves into the rulebook. The competitor material argues that the WNBA's inclusion language creates a potential contradiction. The league and players' union have publicly emphasized principles involving equality, diversity, inclusion, and transgender rights. At the same time, the competition rules determine who can actually participate. That creates a dilemma. If the league rejects the NBA player's declaration, it has to explain exactly which eligibility requirement prevents him from participating. If the league changes or clarifies its rules, critics can argue that the original language wasn't as open-ended as its public messaging suggested. And if the league refuses to respond, the unanswered question becomes even louder. That's the trap. The controversy doesn't require the NBA player to win. It requires the WNBA to answer. And that is much harder to control. Because once the question enters the public conversation, every statement the league has previously made about inclusion can be brought back into the debate. Suddenly, Cunningham's comments look different too.
Than what Coco Gauff said. It's really not.
I don't know. I'm not a very political person, but I do have beliefs, I have morals, and I'll always stand on those and be true to who I am. And I think people are going to take it how they want to take it, but I've never even really said anything about that. And so when it comes just to protecting young girls in sport and women in sport, I feel very strongly about that. I think that's why you have Title IX. That's why you have some of the greats in women's sports. If Title IX and women's sports weren't protected, then you wouldn't hear about any type of women in sport. And so I think in the future, it's just really important to protect.
She wasn't simply making an unpopular statement. Her comments had become connected to a larger argument about how women's sports should define eligibility. And now an NBA player was using the league's own language to force that argument into the open. But there's an even bigger problem. What happens if this isn't the only person willing to test the rules? The competitor material introduces another example involving French basketball and a transgender player who reportedly expressed openness to playing in the WNBA if offered the opportunity. Whether that player actually enters the league is almost beside the point for the documentary's larger argument. The example demonstrates why the policy question isn't theoretical. The moment one person challenges an eligibility framework, other people can ask whether the same framework applies to them. And that's how a single controversy becomes a precedent. The WNBA could potentially clarify the rule. The league could defend the existing language. The players' union could issue another statement. But every response creates another question. And that's where media attention becomes an accelerant. Stephen A. Smith entered the public debate by criticizing the idea of male-born athletes competing against women in sports. Other commentators pushed the issue further. The competitor material even references a satirical proposal for an inclusive WNBA team built around transgender players. Whether those statements were serious, sarcastic, or provocative, they accomplished one thing. They made the controversy impossible to keep inside the basketball locker room. Now the debate was everywhere. Television, social media, podcasts, sports commentary. And the WNBA had another problem. Sophie Cunningham was still at the center of it. But Cunningham wasn't the only person whose name was being dragged into the argument. Caitlin Clark was too. And that's when the stakes became much bigger than one player's eligibility. This is where the story takes its biggest reversal. The title makes it sound like the NBA star wants to destroy Brittney Griner. But the deeper story is about control. Who controls the physical narrative? Who controls the eligibility rules? Who controls the public conversation? And who gets to decide which players deserve protection? Griner represents the established order. Cunningham represents the player who publicly challenged part of that order. Clark represents the superstar whose treatment has repeatedly generated debate. And the NBA newcomer represents disruption. That makes the confrontation much more interesting than a simple physical matchup. Because if the NBA star actually stepped onto a WNBA court, Griner would have every reason to respond through basketball. Use positioning. Use experience. Use timing. Make the newcomer defend. Force them to prove that their physical reputation actually translates into sustained professional performance. The newcomer, meanwhile, would have to prove something completely different. That this wasn't simply a publicity stunt. And Cunningham would have her own challenge. She would need to avoid becoming a character in somebody else's storyline. If the NBA star claims to be protecting her, Cunningham doesn't necessarily have to accept that role. She can answer on the court. She can score. She can defend. She can compete. And most importantly, she can decide for herself whether she wants to be part of the confrontation. That's why the idea of protecting Sophie Cunningham may actually be misleading. The strongest version of Cunningham isn't a player waiting for somebody to rescue her. It's a player who doesn't need rescuing. And that creates the final question. What happens when the supposed protector discovers that the person he's trying to protect can control the story herself? At the beginning, this looked like a story about an NBA star entering the WNBA to challenge Brittney Griner. But after everything is connected, the bigger story becomes much more complicated. It's about a rulebook. It's about inclusion. It's about women's sports. It's about Cunningham's decision to speak publicly. It's about the reaction from coaches and players. It's about the controversy surrounding Clark and Griner. And it's about what happens when somebody outside the system decides to test the system's own rules. That's why this hypothetical matchup will be so explosive. The NBA star brings the disruption. Griner brings the experience. Cunningham brings the controversy. Clark brings the enormous audience. And the WNBA brings the rules that started the entire argument. The biggest question isn't whether an NBA player could physically dominate a WNBA opponent. The bigger question is whether the league could maintain control once someone forced it to explain exactly where its boundaries were. Because once the rules become the story, the basketball becomes only part of the battle. And Sophie Cunningham? She may not need anyone to protect her at all. She may simply need the freedom to compete, and let the scoreboard, the rules, and the facts decide what happens next. So now the question goes back to you. If the WNBA's own rules are challenged, should the league enforce them exactly as written, rewrite them, or explain them differently? And if this NBA star actually stepped onto the court, would Brittney Griner expose the limits of the challenge, or would the entire WNBA suddenly have a much bigger problem? That's the part nobody can answer yet. And that's exactly why this story is worth watching.